Change by Jonathan O. Beer, a Warhammer crime story read by dyslexic little me. Rakove looms over her, impassively watching her struggle as the gas fills her narrow prison. 'Tis not pride that drives her to fight, because she has never known the luxury of pride, the privilege of dignity. Nor is she trying to free herself. She's learned that the tough synth-weave cuffs are beyond her malnourished strength, and a part of her welcomes the relief that the gas brings. The shrieking cacophony of other people's thoughts only abates when her gaolers render her unconscious. She fights just as hard when they wake her, fingers scraping at the transparent interior of her coffin cage in a desperate attempt to claw her way back to the peace of narcotic-induced slumber. No, she fights as a chained animal fights, and for the same reason. Her limbs thrash against the bonds that encircle her wrists and ankles, that press tight against her chest and forehead. She spits and hisses, screaming the curses she's learned as a vagrant thief of Arangantua's pitiless streets. She even tries to lash out with her witch sense, imagining her body's pain as a dagger that she hurls at Rakove's inscrutable form. But she has never really controlled the power that afflicts her. And if her mind's blade lands, he shows no sign of feeling it. The agony collar bites, its barbs flooding her veins with punishment for her pointless resistance. Her body arcs, muscles locked with pain, tears streaming from her eyes. Finally, she slumps against the coffin's bare steel, though the collar continues to scourge her. She has had the strength to fight stolen by the gas that hisses from inlets beside her head and must now endure in mute misery. As the soporific takes hold, Rakove continues to watch her. She looks back at him through the thick plaque, his fleshy face turned into smears of color by the curve of the coffin's lid. Desperation drives her to plead, though she knows there's nothing she can say that will lead him to free her. She can feel his thoughts, hot and cruel behind bloodshot eyes. There is no compassion in him, not for her, only contempt. Melita lurched out of her chair, flailing at the phantom sensation of cuffs on her wrists and fire blazing through her limbs. She scraped her hip against her metal desk's hard edge as she stood, yelped and staggered away. An errant step caught a pile of paper and data wafers, spilling them in a rippling cascade across the office floor. She stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, fists balled. It was dark, and through Melita wanted to snap the lumens on, she could not make herself move. She forced in one breath after another, reaching for calm, even as her heart thundered. She swore, shuddered, and swore again. Each curse was jarringly loud in the near silence, but they helped her shed the clawing, aching touch of the memory that was not hers. It had been the sound of her cogitators this time. For a moment, the rhythm of valves switching, the hum-click of magnetic coils engaging and disengaging within the steel and brass powers of the machinery that crowded the room's far wall, had synchronized into the same rambling pattern as the engines that had pumped the soporific gas into her cage. No, into Alim's cage, not hers. It had been the boy who had entered that torture, not Melita. All at once, the tension left her body, taking her strength with it. Melita collapsed back into her chair, grateful as ever for the embrace of its cracked, welcoming synth leather. As it always did, a headache had begun to bloom behind her eyes, sharp and bitter as the memory that had assailed her. She swore once more and put her head in her hands. A pale finger strayed to the skin of her throat, remembering the barbs of the hateful collar, the sight of red wheels around Alim's neck from their punishment, That had been how Melita had found him, chained and caged by the cruel cabal who had been using him for his unnatural powers. Melita sighed, guilt and anger adding their sour edge to her throbbing headache. She had saved the boy from their clutches, and in return Alim, that was the only name he had given her, and despite furious research, she had been unable to uncover any record of the boy's existence, had used his unnatural abilities to thrust his memories into her mind. That was how the mutant psyker had forced her to shoot him. He had begged for it, pleaded for the last bolt that would put an end to his misery. She had only pulled the trigger to stem the awful tide of pain and indignity that he had violently shared with her. But they had stayed with her. Even after 2 months, the memories were vivid as ever, triggered by stray sights, sounds, or scents. 3 days ago, she had nearly bolted from a meeting with one of her informants. A Jew had rounded the street corner, tossing a handball from palm to palm. Instantly she had lapsed, overcome by the recollection of sudden shock and pain as the rock struck Alim's scalp, the jeers and curses of the encircling crowd. It had taken all her self-control not to set off running, driven by the survival instincts from another person's life. Melita uncovered her eyes and kicked her chair into a slow spin to take her back to face her desk. More data wafers and folders littered its surface. One, the only one that mattered, sat beside her primary rune board, caught in a pool of yellow light from a desk lumen. A face glared at her from a pict fixed to the cover, hard eyes almost lost amid puffy features and a cobweb of broken veins. The image was from Georg Rakov's service record, taken just a few years before he retired from the Enforcers. There were others inside the folder, pulled from the data archives of Joy House Monitor pictures and District Administratum residency records, and even a still from a propaganda reel in which he'd featured some 30 years ago as a young sanctioner. They sat alongside a detailed biography constructed over weeks of arduous research. Melita had traced the path of Rakov's life, learning all she could about Alim's tormentor as she hunted him. The man had gone to ground, hiding from the justice he deserved. The Valteri cartel, Melita's new employers, had tasked her with running him down. Rakova was the only link to whoever had orchestrated Alim's capture, and the attacks that had brought the all-powerful alliance of merchant combines to the brink of civil war. Such elaborate hostility could not be ignored, and Melita had been given access to a seemingly bottomless well of slate with which to pursue him. She doubted there was a single snitch or ganger from Dragosil to Setomir who did not know Rakov's face. It was the Valteri's wrath that Rakova ran from, but it had been Melita's need for vengeance that had driven her through the long nights at Horkogi Chaters. She doubted Rakova had ever heard her name, but she knew him intimately, and not merely from her assembled notes. Alim had been his captive for weeks. The boy had known the taste of Rakova's thoughts, and he had forced that on her along with so much else. Melita stared at the pict, meeting the sanctioner-turned torturer's gaze. Revulsion and rage churned within her, for Rakova and the hateful torture he had inflicted on Alim, for the boy, for obliging her to know that agony herself, and his violation of her innermost self. The office's door chime made her jump. She steadied herself and checked the feed of the external picture on one of the boxy magnifiers on her desk. A familiar face was illuminated by the reflected glare of the street lumens. Melita thumped a switch on the desk to deactivate the electromagnetic locks holding the heavy steel door closed. Eddie Kamensk loomed in the doorway, his broad chest and shoulders made wider by a heavy synth leather coat and a thick woven jersey beneath it. Varangantua's wet season had thrown up one last squall before it gave way to the stifling heat of the dry months, and cold, wet air blew in around him to further upset the papers on her desk and floor. He studied her warily. She had not told him what the psychic had done to her, but the former sanctionary had worked as Melita's bodyguard for 4 years. His look of mute concern had become all too familiar over the past few weeks as she stalked Rakova with single-minded zeal. "What's wrong with your face?" Melita snapped. Eddie's expression dropped into its more typical reassuring scowl. "You ready?" She was. After weeks of hunting, Rakova had finally been revealed to her. Tonight she would expunge the depth of pain owed to a limb and lay to rest the ghost that haunted her. Melita was not a violent woman, but the visceral hatred she had inherited from the psychic had only grown as she hounded his tormentor. Before the night was over, she would see Jorg Rakova delivered into the Valteri's ungentle custody or to the city's crematory fields. "Melita," Eddie prompted. She looked down at Rakova's porcine glare and felt barbs pulling at the skin of her throat. "Let's go." The twin beams of the groundcar's headlamps got bright streaks through the pouring rain as they drove along deserted arterials and across pitch-black junctions. They had driven deep into the heart of the spoil, following a route Eddie and Melita knew well. Her business took them to every corner of the dilapidated sprawl, although it would have been foolish for either of them to let their familiarity turn into complacency. "That's coming along," said Eddie as they crossed a span of elevated highway. The object of his comment was hard to miss. An expansive collection of rockcrete and brick buildings rose from a patch of derelict land half a mile to the south. The compound was lit by bright sodium lamps that shone in the darkness, illuminating dozens of men and women who were working despite the lateness of the hour. In contrast to the districts surrounding the spoil, construction was a major employer for the region's itinerant laborers. So few basic utilities were available to the unfortunates that eked out their lives within the spoil's borders. But every year a little more seemed to be added. In this case, the furnaces were intended to pipe power and heat from the nearby into the nearby hubs, although only for those who could pay for such a luxury. "Sorokin wants it running before the end of the year." Melita had been paying close attention to the erection of the furnaces. Every brick, bolt, and cable was provided by Andretti Sorokin, the ganger king of the spoil. The city had abided the region to its color, and the whole gangs had filled the void. They drove on, leaving the builders to their task. The roads were almost empty, but that was typical. The spoil's nightlife was a coy, tense affair. Those with the slate to spend freely were typically gangers, and were a liability to any revel house they frequented, as well as to anyone who happened to be sharing it with them. Most denizens of the spoil kept to themselves after Alecta's one sun had set, or else hid from their miseries in tiny drinking dens converted from the basement rooms of hub blocks. Those found roaming the streets were usually stumbling to or from narco-pushers' corners. But while venues for higher-class amusement were rare in the spoil, they were not non-existent. The Tesserald was a joy house, although, like everything in the neglected morass of abandoned foundries and rotten hub stacks of the spoil, the revelry was a faded echo of what that title could mean in a true district of the city, where a Dragosil joy house might blaze with kaleidoscopic neon. The Tesserald's grime-hazed windows flickered with greasy yellow light, where they were not boarded up. Where Melita would have expected armored-clad private securitors standing sentinel over a carefully corralled queue of off-duty clerks and administrators, here gangers shook down the Vargans and dispossessed laborers who approached the entrance for proof they had sufficient slate for the night's amusements. It wasn't even a purpose-built joy house. The Tesserald was set back from the street and had the look of a merchant baron's townhouse. 3 stories of time and toxin-etched stone reared above Melita as Eddie steered the ground car into the building's courtyard. Streams of chem-rich water fell from the mouths of gargoyles atop its eaves, and scalped cherubim leered from the columned portico. The stone columns between which Eddie and Melita drove would have once held iron gates to ensure the mansion's occupants were undisturbed by the rabble. But the gates and the rest of the courtyard's railings had likely been wrested from their foundations and sold for the value of their metal by enterprising spoilers long ago. They were stopped just inside what remained of the Joy House boundary by a pair of gangers who shone hand lumens into the ground car's interior. They glanced inside, then, evidently satisfied they were not a stop-gun-toting crew of rival gangers, pointed towards a covered depot. Melita climbed out of the ground car as soon as the engine died, bracing herself against the biting wind and torrential rain. Eddie climbed out more slowly, one hand resting protectively on the vehicle's roof. He had not wanted to bring Katushka, his prized antique Dymaxion Model 34, into the spoil, fearing the jealousy of the gutter, but Melita had insisted. Everything that happened from this moment forward will be an exercise in projected status, in pretending at confidence and composure no matter what obstacles were set in her way. She had dressed with that goal in mind. Though Melita rarely made an effort at her attire, she had made her living as an info broker for 4 years, and experience had taught her that appearances mattered on the street just as much as in the offices of the merchant combined executor. Her expensive real leather jacket cut high above her hips, tight breeches, and thick-soled calf-health boots were what she thought of as her armor, the face with which she met the world and its trials. She had not brought Oriel as much as she wanted to. As much as she would have been reassured by the server's close proximity, she knew that her query's piranha would not permit her to bring so lethal an entity into his presence. Andy rounded the ground car's frame, shoulders hunched against the downpour, the hand cannon at his hip visible beneath his coat. That will have to do. They started for the Joy House portico, but a huddle of gangers in grey synth leathers loomed out of the shadows to bar their path. "What you want, Upclave?" Melita did not blink. "I'm here to see the king." The lead ganger's facial tattoos concorded as he made a posture of derision. "You and half a scum of the spoil! Piss off!" "He will want to see me." "Is that so?" Melita dipped a hand inside her jacket and withdrew a blue slate. She held it between thumb and forefinger for a moment to ensure she had the ganger's attention. "My name is Melita Voronova. He will want to see me." She flicked the chip to the ganger, who smartly plucked it from the air. The bribe was on the high side for so small a thing as getting through the open door, but Melita reasoned that a flash of slate now would set the tenure for the conversation to come. Besides, it was not her money she was giving away. The man sniffed, then stepped back to let Melita and Eddie pass, but not before sending a member of his crew inside to warn of their arrival. Heat billowed from the Joy House's interior, foetid air streaming where it met the night storm's blasted chill. The wet slap of humidity was foul, and Melita fought to keep her face neutral. It was not just the heat. The rain had blunted the spoil's usual reek of refuse and open sewers, and so the ripe fig of compacted humanity was particularly sudden and repulsive. They forced their way through the press of bodies, Melita leading but with Eddie close behind. They passed from the vestibule into a larger reception hall, where the crowd thinned sufficiently for Melita to catch her breath. The hall was dominated by a pair of staircases that curved from opposite walls up to the second level. The stairs formed an arc through which most of the crowd were trying to move, but the hall also branched left and right towards other, evidently less popular entertainments. The Joy House retained enough of its character as a former gilded manse to feel strangely dissonant. Vendors served pitchers of Slatov from stalls set up beneath ornate coving. Bill papers advertising the Joy House's diversions were pasted over discolored patches of plastered wall that should have held portraits of the owner's king. Men jostled one another in ill-tempered disagreement on a tiled floor that must have been the work of a dozen skilled artisans. An imperial aquila carved from black marble crowned the apex of the arch under the stairs, a common affirmation of loyalty in the homes of the gilded. But in his house, the heads of both eagles had been hacked away, and the aquila's wings were similarly chipped back to nubs. Melita could not see Eddie's face, but she was sure he noticed the casual desecration of the imperial emblem, and was grateful that he kept his disapproval to himself. Despite accompanying her on almost all of her sojourns into the spoil for the past 4 years, Eddie had never lost his strangely innocent dismay at how far the spoil and its designates had fallen from the Emperor's light. Both staircases were blocked by more knots of gangers clad in grey, who snarled at anyone that either through curiosity or the accidental motion of the crowd came too close. One man, dressed more like a cleric than a street blade, stood halfway up the right-hand side, evidently waiting to catch Melita's eye. They pushed their way forward as he descended to meet them. "I am Nurem Babich," he had to shout over the din of voices that suddenly roared from beneath the arc. "This way!" "Weapons first," grunted one of the guards. Melita nodded in mute acceptance and held open the lapel of her coat to let the ganger reach in and withdraw her snub-nosed last pistol from its hostler. Eddie, with far less grace, gave up his enormous Suleiman engager, his smaller backup auto-pistol, and his Joe snapper. The last of these was handed over with particular reluctance. Melita was sure he carried the knuckle duster as a proxy for the shock maul he had worn for every day of his 32 years as a sanctioner. They were led up the curve of the staircase and through a synthwood door. The cacophony of voices was reduced to a tolerable level for only a moment as Babich led them along a short corridor and opened the door at its end without knocking. Many people claimed to rule the areas of the spoil. Even the lowest crew of street blades could call a particular corner the territory. But just like the rest of the city, true ownership was found much higher. A crew of narco-pushers might occupy a street, but a clave captain controlled the block. And while the clave captains might squabble amongst themselves, and even wage brief and bitter wars for particularly valuable tracts of land, they were all bound within the Hardrahol, the alliance of gangs that had transformed the spoil from a divided, catastrophically poor urban wilderness into a single semi-coherent whole. The man at the center of that whole was Andreti Sorokin, the king of the Hard Horl. He bore a passing resemblance to Eddie, in that they were both big men, powerfully built, but for whom time's knife had begun to cut. Sorokin's hair and beard were closely cropped, both more grey than black. He had a slightly hunched posture, but this emphasized rather than diminished the air of menace that bled from him. Sorokin was a hulking, aging brawler who had built a throne for himself atop the bodies of every other spoiled ganger who had made the mistake of opposing his rise. She knew from her informants within Sorokin's household that his eyesight was fading, but he wore no lens or other aids tonight. He stood as they entered, gesturing with a hand holding a glass of what looked like a masek to beckon them inside. "Mistress Voronova, what an unexpected pleasure." Andreti Sorokin's voice was unlike any other. It started in the great barrel of his chest, deep as a grave, hoarse from a lifetime of whispered threats and bellowed curses. He spoke in a strangely wandering manner, lingering on some words and biting off others. It was deeply disconcerting, like most everything else about the king of Hard Horl. "Messer Sorokin." "Andreti, please." Melita inclined her head. "I was grateful. for the invitation." Sorokin blinked, apparently nonplussed. "Did I invite you, Mrs. Voronova? Far as I see it, you have appeared suddenly before me, waving your master's slate about to interrupt a rare night of leisure." Melita registered his note of disapproval regarding her bribery of the doorman, but pressed on. "You let it be known that you have Georg Rakove, and that you will be here tonight."
"Yes, I did."
He abandoned his pretense immediately and waved a hand at one of the chairs that occupied the box.
"Well, come on then, sit, have a drink. Talk to me about Jorg Rakove."
The fighting was a distraction Melita could have done without. They sat in a pair of overstuffed armchairs at the edge of his private box, with Eddie and Sorokin's own bodyguards standing near at hand. The box had evidently once been a balustraded landing overlooking one of the townhouse's receiving chambers. The enterprising operator of the occupied months had sectioned off the landing into discrete spaces, like the private booths of a theater, and Sorokin had occupied the largest of these, as was his right and privilege. Beneath them was the fighting pit. The box overlooked the main hall, and at least 300 people had crammed themselves into the narrow space. Whoever ran the joy house had prized up the flagstones at the hall's center to create a shallow square, and this pit was hemmed in on all sides by a roaring crowd of gangers, laborers, and other spoiled dregs. Above them were more boxes, like Sorokin's, and from those more men and women cheered and jeered. The spoils, makeshift joy houses, and other venues of salacious entertainment were heady temptations for a certain class of gilded sensualist, drawn to the illicit substances and unlicensed flesh found at civilization's edge. All of these were readily available in Setomir's and Dragostil's own dens and alleys, but in the spoil they were accompanied by the alien thrill of true poverty. Several knots of these gaudily dressed rakes occupied the boxes opposite Sorokin's, though they were outnumbered at least 3-1 by more sober companions. Only the most foolhardy hedonist ventured beyond the Rustwater Canal without a sizable contingent of their families' lifeguards. Melita watched as two men, stripped to the waist, emerged from the crowd and stepped down into the fighting pit. As odds were called and bets taken, Melita wondered how purposeful was Sorokin's choice of location for their meeting. Immediately she dismissed the question as naive. Everything was a test. A ringmaster was calling the fighter's name through roars of approbation, while another lifted the length of chain perhaps 3 yards long from the sound of the pit. With a surprising amount of ceremony, the ringmaster fixed each end of the chain to the fighter's wrists with a heavy metal cuff. Then he withdrew a pair of long-bladed knives from a case held by another assistant and spun them for the crowd's appreciation. With one final shout, he tossed the knives into opposite corners of the pit, and the fight was on. Melita leaned back as cries erupted from beneath her. Almost instantly, the tongue of blood cut through the choking miasma of sweet inhumanity and noxiously sweet body scents. Melita kept her face in an impassive mask and fought down the sensory bombardment. "Where is he?" Sorokin took a slow swallow of Amasek before replying.
"Safe, contained."
"Rakove is scum," she said between cheers. "The Valteri want him, and they will pay to have him." There was no point being coy. Both of them knew why they were there, and the rest was merely haggling over their cost.
"Before we get to that,"
Sorokin leaned back in the chair. He combined his odd mode of speech with a roaming, inconstant gaze, looking from the fighting pit to Melita, to the crowd, to his drink, and back to the pit.
"What's a smart young thing like you doing in hock to that band of usurers and idolaters?"
His voice dropped low in his condemnation of the cartel. Melita had assumed this would come up and had an answer ready. "They pay well."
"Is that right?" Well, that is a shame.
How so? Sorokin's eyes stopped their roving and met hers. Melita felt the sudden force of his attention and judgment. He was a fierce, angry stare, a challenge to whatever or whoever he turned it on.
We know each other of old. I thought better of you.
She turned, uncertain how to take that. Melita and Sorokin had met perhaps 3 times in the past few years. Each encounter had been a moment of high tension for her, but Melita was surprised he remembered her at all. She swiftly considered how best to respond to his apparent disappointment. You do not seem to mind being seen to deal with a Valtteri. That was a risky play. It was common knowledge that Sorokin, the warlord who had built an empire from the ashes of the spoil, was backed by the Valtteri cartel. He had reined in the excesses of his slave captains, outlawed the engine gunners that preyed on Valtteri convoys, and in return they kept him in power, with a steady flow of slate, weapons, and whatever else he desired. Or at least that was the rumor that had become the truth on the street. Melista saw that her jibe had landed.
Dealing's one thing. Being at the end of their leash is another. I am beholden to nothing and no one. I do not think you can say the same.
They sat in silence, or the closest thing to silence, with howls of glee and derision heaving up from the pit.
So why is it your employers?
He put a special emphasis on the word want him. Melita was relieved to be back on easier ground. What has Rakove told you?
Told me? I have not spoken to him. The bastard does not even know that I'm the one who has him. He thinks he's holed up in a safe house used by a bunch of bliss pushers.
That was a lot of information to give away, and Melita wondered how much of it was true. In a place as vast as the spoiled, it will be almost impossible to narrow down a list of locations that narco pushers might use to stash their goods.
You didn't answer me. What's Rakove to the Valtteri?
Melita had gone back and forth on just how much truth to give him. He harbored a psyker inside the spoiled. He used it to attack the cartel's interest. Sorokin made a face, a pious scowl at the mention of heretic witchery, but Melita could see that he had already known everything she had told him. Another gale of hoots and whistles erupted from the fighting pit. Sorokin gestured over the balcony's edge.
Who would you favor,
he asked, suddenly switching topics. I am sorry.
Let's say I give you the mutant horde in scum if you pick the winner.
Melita scoffed. You are not going to do that.
I might.
He stared back at her. Insincere to the offer clearly was. His challenge was very real. She frowned and leaned forward to look over the balustrade's lip. The two new fighters could not have been more different. One was a mountain of a man, his upper body one vast slab of scarred muscle. He looked like a foundry worker, or perhaps a stevedore for the shallow-bottomed hulks that crossed the rushed water with cheaply made goods turned out from the spoils workshop. The other was a woman, also tall, but surely no more than a third of the man's weight. She wore a cut-down body glove exposing lethally muscled arms. Her hair was shaved to a finger's width all over, and she spun her knife with rapid flicks of the wrist, watching for her opponent's reaction. Despite herself, Melita tried to gauge which would be the victor. The crowd evidently favored the woman, cheering at each flash of her knife, jeering the giant's caution as he turned in the center of the pit, moving as quickly as he could to follow the woman's dancing motion. In less than a minute, both of them were bleeding from thin cuts and offhand blows. Melita winced. The pain from those wounds must have been immense, tugged and jarred as they were by the demands of the fight. The woman changed direction with an elegant spin, but the man read the move and was ready with a clenched fist swung backhanded. She rolled away from the blow, but only as far as the chain that bound them together would allow. He started to heave. The woman's heels left trails in the blood-wet sand as she resisted, strength set against strength. But then she darted in, left hand raising quickly to twitch the sudden slack in the chain. The curl of metal leapt up, but at the last second the man jerked his head away so that the chain lashed across his temple rather than blinding him as the woman had intended. She was on him in a heartbeat, blade moving like quicksilver as the giant backpedaled. She cuffed him 3 times with shallow cuts to his massive torso, but the man's roars of pain made her overconfident. As he stepped in for the kill, he checked his backward motion. She ran straight into his hugely muscled hip, staggered away, and in the breath's second of confusion, the giant reached forward almost casually and drang the length of his blade across her bicep. The woman reeled back, blade abandoned so she could clutch at the horrendous wound that had laid her arm open to the bone. The crowd groaned as the giant raised his hands in triumph. The motion jerked the woman's head from her mutilated arm, and blood sprayed in an arc into the faces of the front rank of the crowd. Melita lurched back, sick to her stomach. Sorokin half stood from his seat.
Nicely done.
The mob roared back, their bias towards the stricken woman forgotten in the face of Sorokin's approval. The victor, for his part, tapped the flat of his wet knife against his chest in salute, then waited for the ringmaster to remove the chain from his wrist. The woman's crew had already freed her and were pushing their way to the opposite side of the hall. He settled back into his seat.
Well, too slow there. Shame too.
It is no one's interest to have a man like Rakove walking the street. Melita's pulse quickened. She was almost certain that he was teasing her, looking for another angle from which to test and probe her. But the fear of losing Rakove when she was so close was palpable. It is a shame, Melita managed to keep her voice level, since I would have picked him.
Easy to say now.
Sorokin's eyes glittered with amusement, glad that Melita was keeping up with his game.
But for argument's sake, why?
You can be quick and you can be canny, but being tough enough to ride the blows is what sees you through a fight. That had been one of her mother's pearls of wisdom, hard learned from a life spent warring with other smuggling clans beneath the massive stanchions of the Dragosil void ports.
Is that so?
Sorokin seemed to ponder her words.
So you always bet on the big man?
Usually. Melita had a premonition of approaching horror, but was powerless to stop it.
Right, then. I have a new proposal. You can have Rakove if your man wins a bout in the pit on your behalf.
Melita froze. Behind her, she felt Eddie stiffen.
I mean it.
The mockery was gone, or at least it had disappeared behind the mask of rigid intensity.
Blood for blood. The way everything is settled out here beyond the world's edge.
Melita's heart pounded, loud enough to hear. She was paralyzed. She had been so clear that Sorokin had come intending to make a deal, but his careless jibes and goading had thrown her off balance. She trailed off. She will never allow Eddie to set foot in the pit, but she could not let Rakove evade her revenge. There's no way you'll... Eddie twitched the cord from his soldiers.
I'll need to borrow one of those knives.
She spun in her seat. Eddie, don't. As soon as she said the words, an involuntary whisper, something changed in Sorokin's eyes. Triumph. He had got what he was looking for. He had cut through her layers of front and indifference and forced her to let slip something real, something true about herself. Melita cared about Eddie. He was probably the only person left in Varangantua who still mattered to her, and Sorokin had effortlessly drawn her into giving that vulnerability away.
Maybe there's no need, said Sorokin, leaning back. After all, folk are lining up to fight in front of me. I would not like to deprive some young talent their turn in the spotlight.
Melita seethed. She had lost all patience with Sorokin's antics, his casual jests and vibes. You did not come here to gamble. You are holding Rakove because you're looking to get paid. What is your price? His eyes narrowed, either with amusement at her temper or anger at her insinuation.
Make me an offer.
The cartel's agents had given her close to a free hand to obtain Rakove's head. She could offer him the deeds to land and property in half the city, off-world treasures, immunity for his agents and allies beyond the spoil, or enough slate to bury anything that could still trouble him. But Melita's blood was still up, and she gave into a reckless impulse. Rejuvenant gems. Sorokin's stare turned brittle, just slightly enough to know that she had struck a nerve in return. The king of the hard world was an old man in a world that punished weakness. For the Gilded, age was nothing but a number, their careless immortality brought with the labor of the millions who toiled at their command. Sorokin was undoubtedly as rich as any 3 merchant barons Melita could name, but the spoil was not the place to find the exclusive, highly secured therapeutic clinics one needed to enter in order to achieve rejuvenant's full results. He gave a rough sort of laugh. A recognition of a point landed.
Nice try, but no. Those I can source myself, if I were ever to be so vain as to want them.
Then what? Sorokin said nothing for a long time. Then he slowly stood, all of a sudden wearing the years that Melita had mocked. He rounded his armchair, ignoring the cries for his attention from the pit below, and crossed the box to a narrow shelf that held an array of glass bottles.
I am constantly disappointed by you upclaver's low regard for what I have done, what I am trying to do.
He lifted the bauble-like decanter of Amasek and poured himself a tall measure.
Do not get me wrong. I understand it. Everyone needs somebody to look down on. But it does irk me.
Realization dawned. In her 30 years in Sorokin, and the 30 years in Sorokin had reason to command the length and breadth of the spoil, he had not merely exploited the people still trapped inside it. He had built, cut off from the city's infrastructure, Sorokin had set about creating his own, like the furnaces she and Eddie had passed on their way to the Tesseralde. For all that the spoil's facade was broken and its bones rotten, Sorokin was doing what he could to graft piece by piece the muscle and sinew of a functioning district into the spoil's decaying frame. But there will be so much beyond his reach. Bricks and mortar were one thing, but to build generatoria, sanitation plants, data junctions, that required complex equipment and refined parts, machined to the existing templates of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Such things will be difficult to acquire in the quantities that the spoil needed, even for the king of the hard world. She spoke slowly and carefully. I am certain that the produce of the Valteris Manufactoria can be made available to you, Messer Sorokin. He turned, glass half raised to his lip. He grinned.
Not bad. I had to walk you right up to it, but not bad.
Sorokin made a summoning gesture with his free hand. Babbage, the ganger who had led them in, crossed the box quickly and handed him a pasteboard card. Melita could see the tight alphanumerics of a lock ref stamp to one side and nothing else. She fought the desperate temptation to try and snatch it from the old man's hands. Sorokin flicked the card with a thick finger.
I'll have Babbage send you a list. If everything on it, and I mean everything to the last bolts and rivet, is delivered to my crews by midnight tomorrow, then I'll see to it that Rakove will be here the following morning.
You'll have it. She made the promise instantly, carelessly.
Mess me around, and he'll vanish beyond even your powers to dredge up.
They won't. Sorokin, conscious of her stare, continued to toy with the card.
What's Rakove to you, Mistress Voronova?
Melita tried to affect nonchalance, although it was far too late for that. Do you care? Sorokin drew out the silence for several rapid beats of Melita's heart, then shrugged.
I suppose not.
The gangler tossed her lock ref to her like a card shot, and Melita plucked it from the air. She had him. Melita coughed the tremor in her hand as it started, but too late to stop the surge of sensation that overtook her. The control stave for the agony collar was in Rakova's pocket. She was inside his mind, and she could feel the bulge of the stave against her hip. The hatred polluting his thoughts was a bitter heat, a fever that set her limbs trembling as much as the collar's barbs. There was nothing about her that he considered human, no shred of pity or guilt for the torment he inflicted. What pity he had was for himself, forced to taint his soul by proximity to her abhuman existence. She tensed, mewling pleas rising to her lips as he withdrew the stave and thumped it on. Sorokin was still talking.
I have 4 men keeping an eye on him. Do not kill any of them.
Melita breathed out, trying to control the violent shiver in her chest. She sensed Eddie place a hand against the chair's back, as close as he dared to comforting grip. Melita leant away from him and instead pressed a thumb against the edge of the card. Rakova had lost. She had freed Alim, and now she would trap him in his own cage. She would show him where the limits of her mercy lay. If Sorokin noticed her distraction, he didn't comment on it.
Do you know why I'm giving Rakova to you? Other than the fact that he brought a witch into my ground, and I will not harbor any man who trifles with their kind.
It took her a moment to stammer a reply. Why? Melita itched to leave, to escape the stink of blood and sweat and the changeable warlord whose word was law.
Because you asked.
He drained his glass, placed it on the table between them, and flicked it into its side, where it rolled back and forth.
I let you learn I had him, but you could have found out eventually. You are a smart one.
Melita was still too caught up in the aftermath of the memory to register his compliment.
But you came here to ask me for him. I like that. It shows respect, shows we understand each other.
The old man picked up his glass, turning it one way and the another in the grazy light.
But on the other hand, the Valtteri sent you. Not that any of the top men would ever come here themselves. I've made my peace with that. But they have an army of faceless worms to fetch and carry for them, and yet they sent you. Why do you think that is?
Melita knew exactly why, and had nothing to do with Sorokin. It had been a test. The cartel had adopted her into their organization because she had been the one to find Alim when every other organ of their will had failed, and because she had been desperate enough to sell her skills to them. That test had not been to track Rakova down. Her masters had been entirely confident that she was capable of that. No, the true test had been this night, in whether she could acquire him and for what price. They had given her a free hand to spend as she had to because their coffers were that deep and their wrath that great, but she would be judged on what she had given away in return. It was impossible to know how well she had done by that metric. She was sure that Sorokin's list of demands will represent an extortionate price for the sale of one man. Sorokin needed to hear none of this. She forced a smile. Because they knew you'd like me, Mr. Sorokin. He laughed at that, with a sound like a canid's bark.
That could be it. Right enough.
He lifted that decanter and poured himself another measure.
Go on, then. Clear off with your prize. Let me see if I cannot salvage something from this evening.
Melita stood, grateful to be away, still shaken by the flash of memory and the fear of almost losing Eddie to the pit. She clutched the card in her hand. She had stumbled almost every hurdle Sorokin had placed in her path. She was living with what she had come for only because he wanted her to give it away. She had failed by almost every measure except the one that mattered. Sorokin rapped his glass against the decanter's side to stop her as she reached the door.
Good to see you, Mistress Voronova. Until next time you need something.
Melita said nothing, and she slipped out of the box. The previous day's storm had not abated. The sound of freezing rain breaking against the ground car's bodywork was the only sound in Melita's world. She and Eddie sat inside Katushka's carefully maintained interior, 2 blocks from the lock Rev Sorokin had provided. The Valteri had moved quickly, marshalling their considerable resources to meet Sorokin's price. A well-guarded convoy had rumbled across the Rustwater Canal a few hours earlier, loaded with the future of the spoil's hesitant restoration. Now all that was left was to collect what they had bought. Her Vamprice pinged as Oriel registered the Valteri's approach. She was wearing the lattice, her homemade rig for transporting the Guardian's servo skull. The chromed skull squatted on her shoulder, its needler larking at the corner of her side, its suite of sensors feeding information through the carved data slate that was clamped around her forearm. They came into 2 of their enormous sheave hegemons, each closer in size to an enforcer roid wagon than a civilian ground car. Their huge flanks showed the insignia of the Reisiger Company, a band of mercenaries who handled much of the cartel's security and related activities. Melita and Eddie had no role in what was to come, but there had never been any question that she would be there for Rakov's capture. The 2 hegemons came to a stop at the end of the street, surprisingly quiet for vehicles of such size. The rear of one of the ground cars opened and a quartet of mercenaries emerged. With professional efficiency, they trotted towards the hub block's door, which was opened for them by an unseen figure within. They disappeared inside. The seconds ticked by, agonizingly slowly. Melita could not sit idle. She opened the ground car's door and leant out, and the servo skull detached from the lattice with a purr of its suspensors. With a flurry of tapped commands, she sent the skull up into the darkness, pursuing the mercenaries who had become their climb through the levels of the hub block, raindrops rolling from its silver plating. Watching through the skull's thermal sensor on her vambrace, Melita could follow the progress of the Valteri men as they rose through the hub block's stairwell. Other smears of color showed residents retreating into their rooms, no doubt fearing the sudden tramp of heavy footsteps outside their hubs. Melita panned up. The first of the Valteri men had reached the 3rd floor, and they were evidently stacking up outside the target hub. Inside were a clutch of figures, but Melita had no way of knowing which was Rakove. They were evidently sitting in the hub's communal area. She made a note to try to speak to the gangers who had been Rakove's minders. Anything he might have told them could be relevant to tracing his elusive backer. One of the shapes twitched around, its limbs a smear of colors as it stood. There was just enough time for dread to settle in Melita's stomach, and then gunfire shattered the night. Melita's head rose on instinct towards the sound in the same moment that Eddie pressed her protectively down into her seat. She struggled under his weight, desperate to know what was happening. More shots rang out, the harsh bark of a large caliber stab pistol and the chatter of autoguns. She awkwardly twisted her body to bring her vambrace up in front of her and refocus the imagifier. Melita switched from the thermal sensor to Oriel's picture. But the skull saw nothing but the flash of multiple muzzle flares. By the throne! She pulled herself from beneath Eddie's weight and pushed open the ground car's door. She leapt out and raced the length of the block. She rounded the corner, almost falling on the sleek broken pavings. The mercenaries were emerging from the hub block, surrounded by others who had appeared from the hegemon's passenger compartments. Slung between 2 of the armored bodies was a heavy-set figure, knees scraping on the steps, head slammed forward and forward to almost touch the concrete. Melita ran on, reaching for the last pistol hostel beneath her shoulder. She struggled to clear it from the synth leather, swore as she stumbled, and then stopped short as one of the mercenaries stepped into her path. Out of the way. All rational thought had fled with the first gunshot. The Valteri's need for what Rakova knew had ceased to matter, if it ever had to her. Melita would kill him, here and now, for Alim, for herself, for all his crimes against her and whoever else Rakova had wronged in his brutal life. But he was already dead. The mercenaries laid Rakova on the street, blood flowing into the puddles of acrid rainwater. Melita gaped. Thoughts misfired into the rat-bit temper of wasted adrenaline. What the hell's happened? The mercenaries ignored her, busying themselves with unloading their guns and pulling off their armor. They seemed far from happy. One of them would have to explain to the Valteri's executors how they had so catastrophically failed at what should have been a simple collection of an unarmed man. But first they would have to explain it to her. Well? One of the race-eager men stopped peeling the sections of plate from his chest. The target grabbed the weapon of one of the gangers that were with him. We had to drop him. An overwhelming weight settled on her shoulders. She had hoped to feel a measure of relief, but all she felt was frustration. The Valteri's questions would go unanswered. Whoever had supported Rakove's operation would evade their grasp and perhaps make use of some other unfortunate to try again. Alim's torturer was dead, but justice would have seen him suffer at Melita, as Melita knew the boy had suffered. A quick death was not revenge enough for her. By the damned throne! Melita tore the data slate from her arm and hammered it into the asphalt. Shards of flex and arcane electronics flew away into the darkness. The mercenary turned back to the hegemon's interior, ignoring Melita's outburst. She suddenly became aware of Eddie's grip on her shoulder. Pulling her away, Melita shrugged him off and turned, choosing Eddie to be the target of her frustrated rage and confusion. Why were you going to fight last night, back at the Joy House? She had been holding in the question for the entire day, but now it erupted unbidden. The former sanctioner said nothing. Answer me.
Because you needed this,
he said finally. He turned to look at her, face stricken with rage. Melita felt oddly alarmed by the strength of feeling that filled his eyes.
Whatever that witch did to you.
Eddie looked like he wanted to spit, but instead he silently made the sign of the Aquila over his chest.
Whatever it did, it got inside your head. I've watched you. You always work like you're possessed, but this past month you've been a maniac. Hyper-focused, like only one thing existed. You needed to see this done, and I wanted to help you do it.
Melita gaped. Without a word spoken between them on the subject for 2 months, Eddie had cut to the core of her turmoil. She felt exposed, laid bare, just as she had been by Alim's casual penetration of her mind. He was right, of course. It might not have been the catharsis she had hoped for, but she had needed to see Rakove broken one way or another. She glanced back to watch the Valteri men load the body into one of their vehicles.
What do you want to do now? Eddie asked.
Melita sighed. She knew it was too much to hope that she would be rid of Alim's implanted memories. They were a part of her now, a parallel life of trauma and fear that she would have to endure just as the Psyker had. But perhaps, if she was lucky, she might finally have a night of unbroken rest. Take me home,